Well, hello everyone and welcome back. This is part 3 from the Box of Commodore series, where we're taking a look at a bunch of Commodore computers that I got in a $40 box at Retro Gaming Expo. So I'm a bit frustrated, and before I get into the actual video much, I just want to talk about why I'm frustrated. I had a bunch of camera footage that was lost that I shot while I was working on this machine. So when I played it back, I had huge gaps and pieces of video that were missing. I'm not quite sure what I did to lose them. So I am now working in voiceover mode, trying to put together the pieces of video that I have so that you know what happened with the third Commodore 128 out of this batch. This Commodore 128 was a little bit different story from the last two that we looked at, and while those machines had minor issues, this one seemed to have much more serious problems. So what I did was to just fire this machine up, and right away I could see from the screen that came up that we had issues. It was not booting in Commodore 128 mode, although if I held down the Commodore key and restarted, it was working in Commodore 64 mode. So now it was basically time for me to scratch my head a little bit and do some reading, try to figure out what could be wrong with this machine. Since working on the last two C128s, I have acquired a Diagnostic ROM that I did put in the U36 ROM option spot on the motherboard. When I started the system up, though, it did pretty much the same thing as before. We got the garbage screen. We could still boot into C128 mode, so it was not initiating the Diagnostics ROM. And yes, I did also reboot holding the control key down, and we don't seem to be getting far enough through the boot process to get to that option ROM. So after that, what I did was I spent some time working on the board and looking for just general problems, looking at the condition of the sockets, pulling out and reseating the chips, which I know is always a good idea on these old boards. So I did pull all the ROMs and reseat them down, and making sure that we had a good connection on all of them. And again, that seemed to make no difference either. So we will take that off our checklist of things to check, but yep, reseating the chips, no difference, still getting the garbage 128 boot screen. So the next thing that I attempt is to do a little closer check on the RAM, the system RAM, because I've been told that you can flip the CAS line between the two banks of memory and give yourself kind of a quick confirmation as to whether or not those memory chips are fine in both banks. And you do this by booting into C64 mode each time, and if it boots, you're good. Okay, I've done a little setup here to test the theory about the RAM. So we have the two banks of RAM, 64K each, and I've flipped the column address strobe line between the two banks, which in theory should, before you know how we booted up in Commodore 64 mode just fine, and we saw that was working. So we kind of assumed that at least the lower bank of memory was working. Well, flipping those, so I have the upper bank of memory now being addressed as the lower bank, and vice versa. Can we turn the computer on and still end up seeing the Commodore 64 mode? Now, this certainly is not a definitive test, but if we do, it at least tells me that in C64 mode, it thinks that the memory is there and fine. So we're going to give that a shot. So I'm going to connect the keyboard back up. Maybe it just boots straight into 128 mode, and we'll have a better idea maybe what's going on. So let me just grab the keyboard. We'll plug this in, and we'll see what happens. So we have a keyboard hooked back up, so I can power this on. And I think first we'll just power it on normally and see if magically somehow we boot in 128 mode. And pretty much no. We kind of get the garbage screen that we had before, sadly. But I do want to go ahead and try to see if we can get into 64 mode. So hold the Commodore key down. Flip it on. And yes. So this mode at least sees the RAM, and it kind of leads me to believe that the RAM should be in good enough condition for the Commodore 128 mode to boot. So I don't think we're dealing with a RAM issue. So let's see what we do next. Okay, the next quick thing I think I'll check is something that I've seen suggested, which is that it could be the boot ROM, or the ROM that contains the kernel. It's my understanding, and I hope this is correct, if not, please correct me, is that when the Commodore 128 boots, the Z80 processor kicks on first. It goes through the boot routine, looks for the presence of a CP/M disk, and in the absence of that, then goes ahead and boots into 128 mode. I suspect that the Z80 processor itself is okay. I can't verify that yet, but the reason I think that is because my understanding is if you can boot into C64 mode, that probably this is how the Z80 works in the system, that's kind of an indicator that at least it's functional. If I got a garbage screen in 128 mode, could not boot into C64 mode, that might possibly be a more serious indicator that I should look into that Z80 processor. I don't know. That's just kind of my working theory. So one of the things I'm going to try is to work on the premise that perhaps we have a ROM issue. And if I've researched this correctly, I understand that this would be the ROM that we're after. It's right next to this video, or the video can here. And I'm going to pull out that ROM and put in a freshly burned ROM. See if we get any difference there. So set that aside. Give this a try. And let's start by getting it in the right direction. Also heard people say that these are not the best sockets. So hopefully that's not what we're fighting. Okay. Now I'm going to connect the power back up. We'll see if we get anything different. And it would appear not. We're looking at the same garbage screen as before. Let's double check and see if we can boot into Commodore 64 mode still with our new ROM. Yes. Okay, so two things checked. We have checked the RAM, kind of rudimentary check by switching the banks. We've replaced the ROM, and neither of those two things seems to have helped us with the problem. So I'm going to, at this point, restore the wiring on the ROM banks, or flip those resistors back, and I'm going to put back in the original ROM. I'll also do a read on that ROM just to kind of verify that it works, but I don't think that's our problem either. As I was going through my checklist of possibilities of what could be stopping the 128 from booting, one of the things that I've seen suggested is that it could be bad BASIC ROM. So now that we've kind of tested out the initial boot ROM with the kernel and all of that on it, I've decided, well, maybe the next down the line is the BASIC ROM. So I decided to burn a new pair of BASIC ROMs and plug them into the board and then see what happens. With the new basic ROMs installed, it was time to try again, and at first everything seemed the same. But on a second power up, it did actually boot. I couldn't quite explain why this happened, and I couldn't seem to get it to happen again. I did press around on the ROMs just to see if by chance that I had had a poor connection, and by pushing around and restarting, maybe I would be able to boot it again. But I was not able to reproduce this result, so we have a bit more of a mystery on our hands. At this point, I went ahead and put the original basic ROMs back in, and not being able to shake the idea that it could be a loose connection, I spent time reseating all of the socketed chips. Okay, I think I discovered something. So I haven't really been focusing on RAM because I think, just the fact that we can boot into 128 mode sometimes and we have 64 mode, I think that's good. The ROMs, I've cleaned the sockets, I've done everything there, and the boot seems just oddly irregular. Sometimes it boots fine, sometimes it doesn't. And so one other thing that was part of the boot cycle, apparently, at least from what I read, some people were saying if there was a problem with the video RAM, that could actually cause a problem on the boot. And I thought, well, I don't really want to pull out the RAM chips since they're soldered on yet. So instead what I did was I went ahead and pulled the VDC out and just left the VIC in. And one of the things that I've noticed now is that when I power up, I consistently go straight into 128 mode. So I think that our problem is focused somewhere around the VDC or probably the VDC RAM. And so I think what I'll do, I've heard the other thing you can do is leave the VDC in and pull the RAM out. And then if the thing will boot normally, then you've kind of figured your problem out. Now that isn't going to help us much with the 80 columns and other functions of this board, but as a troubleshooting measure, now I am having no issue booting straight into Commodore 128 mode. It doesn't hang or show garbage screens anymore. So I really think that somewhere or another, this has got to do with this 80 column chip and or its RAM. To be on the safe side, I think I am going to try to just deoxit the socket for the VDC and just double check that everything there is good. Okay, reintroducing the VDC chip back into the board is giving us our error again. I think that's kind of pointing to that as the problem. Yep, boots right up. With the VDC chip removed again and the C128 booting, I decided that it was time to insert the Diagnostics ROM back into the option ROM spot in U36 and boot the machine. And what I saw was that it did come up with the diagnostics test, which it seems to have passed successfully, with the exception of some things that show up as bad because I don't have a test harness hooked up. So those are expected, but we can see that the ROMs are good, the RAM is good, the SID, as you can hear, is good and sounds crisp. So it's pretty good news. I think this system, besides whatever's wrong in that 80 column circuitry, is working fine. So in preparation for the arrival of some chips that I ordered the two 64K RAM chips for the 80 column video circuitry. I decided to go ahead and remove the current 16K chips, install sockets, and get ready for those chips to arrive. Now, that doesn't mean it will fix the problem. I'm really hoping that this is a RAM issue in that area of the board and not the actual VDC itself, because if it is, that's a little bit more expensive of a proposition. Well, thanks for sticking with me on this video. It was a little rough with the loss of some of the footage, but hopefully you get a sense of what we found with this third Commodore 128. Thanks again for watching.